All right, so hi everybody. My name's Ian Milham. I'm the art director on Dead Space, which is what I've been working on the past 2.5 years. And this talk is going to be covering sort of the Dead Space art direction, what we were trying to do, specific goals, and all that kind of business. It's kind of a lot to try to cover in this amount of time, so if I don't go over what you came here to kind of find out about, come to the mic at the end. Hopefully we'll have time for Q&A, or otherwise I'll be around, and please come up. Right, so a little disclaimer off the top. Dead Space is a mature rated game. There's some bloody stuff in it, and by nature, this talk's going to have some bloody stuff in it. Nothing too terrible or anything. I think everybody in here can handle it just fine, but I feel compelled to say it. So let's get with the gruesome stuff. This was a trailer we did right around E3 times. And this just sort of to remind people what sort of the final product ended up looking like. I'll roll this. Okay, that's the end of the marketing fluffy stuff. Now it's all other sort of stuff. And bit of trivia, the woman singing in that trailer is just the video editor. She sang it into the mic for a temp track, and we went, oh my God, that's pretty fantastic, so we just kept it. And she also cut the whole thing. Also, everybody goes, I didn't know Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star had 3 verses, but there it does. So this is an outline of what I'll be talking about today. I'll start with sort of just a little bit of context as where the project started, what were our goals, when it was, what we were trying to accomplish. Define a little bit about horror versus sci-fi when it comes to the visuals and what we thought was important about that distinction. And then the meat of the talk is going specifically into bit by bit, color and lighting, user interface, environment design, the player character, weapons and enemies, about how each of those things were trying to sort of support those central ideas. And then I'll do a little bit of what went right, what went wrong stuff, and then I've got some examples from along the way of production of what various elements looked like along the way. And then if I do my job right at the end, we'll have time for some Q&A. All right, so it's January 2006 is when we started. There was about 15 people, and EA was sort of thinking that the time was right to create some new IP stuff. And we knew that our talents led ourselves towards sort of third-person action as what we had sort of known how to make before. Unfortunately, there's a lot of third-person action going around and sort of sci-fi action, hardcore stuff. And we knew as a new IP we wanted to, as much as possible, avoid going right into the teeth of Gears and of those games like that. So we thought survival horror was a cool genre to give a shot at because relative to the amount of people that are fans, there's not actually that many survival horror titles. And we thought it was an area that we could sort of bring something fresh to and that people would pay attention, and we'd establish ourselves right off the bat as like, oh, okay, we're not making a Gears clone or something like that. So that worked out well. We knew for this thing to have any real shot, it had to be good. So we were going for an 85 Metacritic was our stated goal. And given EA's sort of history and culture, we didn't want to get canceled and screw up new IP green lights for anybody else because they sort of had a short fuse and they weren't really used to growing that kind of stuff. As an example, these were the 3 other projects that were in the building when we started. So we had Simpsons, Lord of the Rings, and Godfather. So out of those 4, these 3 plus us, who's getting canceled if things go wrong? Right? We're the ones getting canceled because there's no contract that says Dead Space has to come out. There's no built-in movie to tie to. So even if we were doing okay, but one of those other projects had trouble and needed people, we were the ones who were going to get screwed. So we knew from the beginning that our stuff had to be awesome at every step. So it was just not even a debate about whether we would continue. And when I say let's not get fancy at the top there, what I'm talking about is specifically the art direction. Like what I was staring in the face of when we started was our risk tolerance was pretty much maxed out from the start. We got the new IP up against all this established stuff. We don't have a lot of people. When we started in January of 2006, there was no next-gen engine in-house that we could really use, and one was months away. And specifically, a more stylized art style was going to work against horror, which was our stated goal, because you need a certain relatability, and if I made, as much as I completely love Little Big Planet or Prince of Persia or a more stylized look, that sort of was going to run counter to our goals. So I knew that whatever I was going to do as art director had to work on a more subliminal level. So when we started to sort of throw around what the differences were in our different looks and stuff and how we needed to stay away from sci-fi action because it had tons of competition and there was little competition in horror, we started to analyze what the differences were between that sort of stuff. And one of the things we came up with was if you're doing your job right in a horror game, right, the player's moving slowly through the world. It's not blowing past big scenes. It's not about square footage so much as it is about detail and environmental storytelling. So we knew that our environments had to stand up to a level of scrutiny that maybe others didn't, because people were going to be walking through them slowly and analyzing stuff and seeing, is that a bad guy or what's going on? And we were going to get a lot of pressure there. You want a little more mystery and be less explicit and bright with the world and with everything going on, because if the world is fully defined for you and you can kind of figure out where every nook and cranny is, there's not much room for that fear to exist. And specifically with the player, he had to be more of a fragile everyman than a superheroic ass kicker, because you need that feeling of vulnerability, which runs counter to a lot of game stuff in order to get the horror right. So speaking specifically about art direction and what that turned into, we sort of boiled it down to these key priorities. It had to be accessible, had to be believable and relatable, and once we had achieved all that, it had to be and stay immersive. And what I mean is, like, making scary and horror in a game context is pretty hard, because right off the bat, games are already kind of abstracted. They don't, no matter how photoreal we might say something is, it's not really photoreal yet, not in the way that a film is. And for you to believe that these types of dangers are real and scary, you have to sort of believe the world in a core, easy-to-enter way. And in a game, there's all sorts of trappings that get in the way of that. And there can't be too many logic leaps in the world. Like, we didn't want magic stuff. Already there's sci-fi around, and we wanted to make sure that there was no barriers, that there was nothing that would get hung up on in terms of, I don't really believe what's going down here. And then, this was the other key. Once we'd sort of done all that, how do you keep it immersive? And it was basically we tried to figure out how we could, at the least possible, remind people that they were playing a game. So, these are what we sort of figured out: accessible, believable, relatable, immersive. And now I'm going to go into the specific areas of the art direction and stuff and how we tried to achieve those goals. So first one, and maybe the one that we leveraged hardest but is thought about the least, was the color and lighting. So on the left, I don't need to tell you, everybody in here can figure out already that on the left side, those are horror movies. On the right side, those are sci-fi movies. Now, it doesn't always work out quite so explicitly, but you can see that the horror stuff tends to have warm, ochre, decayed sort of tones, high contrast sort of setups. Compared to the sci-fi stuff, you tend to get cooler stuff, you get brighter hot spots, you get specularity and all kinds of stuff that shows off graphic hardware and your marketing team wants you to put in the game. But it doesn't really jive with that kind of visual excitement, doesn't really jive with the horror feeling. So we're trying to, if we took a screenshot of our game 3 years after this was put together, it should fit nicely on the left side of the screen, not on the right. Then trying to sort of establish a visual influence outside of straight horror. I started to key on David Fincher's stuff and the way he works with his cinematographers and DPs, because the color tones, his movies just feel like Seven. Oh my God, it's not that it's so explicit, but it just feels hopeless and decayed, and that sort of feeling is what we wanted, while still varying up the color and having interest, so you don't just sort of have that next-gen brown that everybody gets raked over the coals for, that we switch it up. But if you look at these frames, they change a lot in color. By the way, you got the Game on the upper left, Zodiac on the upper right, Fight Club and Seven. But you can see the tones change, but the mid-tones are very rich, but the colors actually change. And then so here is a quick breakdown of one of our frames. Dead Space, by the way, uses deferred lighting and deferred rendering. The downside of that is that it has some issues with transparency and stuff. The upside is we had as many lights as we wanted to use. So that worked particularly. So Dead Space tends to be lit by lots of tiny lights, not one big one, but lots of tiny ones. But here's a breakdown of a scene. So there's the ambient texture only. We would add an ambient occlusion pass on top of that just to sort of solidify the world. There's the key light, no shadows yet. Now we got shadows on top of that with a sort of strong shadow line. Then we'd add the VFX and light source texture specifically. Then we would do sort of a pass on the whole thing for bloom and anti-aliasing. And then last, there's the color lookup, which is what the final frame looked like. And there's some other frames from the game that you can see. The color's jumping around a lot, but within one frame, it tends to be pretty consistent and monochromatic. And we would do this specifically. We were playing that thing like a trombone. It was happening all over in the game when you would go through a door, when different stuff happened. Sometimes we would use it to make areas feel different or to play on emotions. And you can see there in the upper left, the big frame is without the color lookup turned on. And then on the lower right is how it looked in the game itself. Same thing in the upper left. Sometimes it's more subtle, like this one, and other times it's really bold. And then we would also use it to sort of build emotion and give clear messaging that something was happening. Although you'd be, going back through this, you'd be surprised at how many people aren't even conscious that the color is changing this much. They just feel more excited, and they're like, oh, the boss is getting weaker, but they don't know why they feel that way. So when you walk into this room, this is what the color looks like. As you start fighting him, some warms start to come into it, but it's not changing too much. And then now you're in the next phase. And then, oh my God, that's what it looks like by the end. And people still aren't even conscious that it's changed that much. But we're doing this just with the color lookup. The lighting itself doesn't actually change that much, but we just sort of bring up the color tones again to reinforce the emotion. So that's what color and lighting sort of was like. Now on to user interface, which was another sort of underappreciated part and something we were trying to crack. Remember when I was talking before about immersion and not reminding people that they're playing a game. So this is a quick 20-second clip of the remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Just check that out for a second. It does have some sound to it. Here's the same clip. I want you to tell me if you can spot a difference. So just the same, but you're just removed from it one step. There's all this other information to process, and you're not really feeling the story nearly the same. And you've seen this clip before, so now you're less scared too. But it's not, you know what I mean? It just doesn't have, it really cuts the impact. So that's a problem. What we were figuring out is that typical HUD elements, they were really kind of killing what we were trying to do. So the stake we put in the ground is, we were going to completely integrate the HUD in the world and try to make it just as usable and help you just as much, but not get in the way, not sort of be conscious of it as this sort of game convention. So that's what we ended up doing. So here's the world with nothing in it, except for the health bar on Isaac's back there and his stasis meter on the shoulder. But there's nothing else in it. And we didn't think that we would need to do too much. That's pretty much what I thought we would need. So you can see on the door there, now there's a little hologram telling you can go in the door. Save station's got a little icon on it, and there's little lights on the lockers. I could not have been more wrong. Because one thing about conventions like user interface is that people are used to them, and they really help give you important information. And then in a sci-fi setting, we have dispensed with some information that people subconsciously count on, like what does a door casing look like? And doors usually have knobs on them. And we found that people walked around this room for about 15 minutes, never going to that door, never coming out, because it wasn't messaged clearly enough, and the sci-fi thing was hurting us on top. So, added a halo around the door. That helped quite a bit. And that's, although I resisted it at first, we had to end up doing that. But still, people were not finding the door at all. So now every door in the game has a big sign over it with an arrow and a description of what's beyond the door and some sort of tease about what it could be. And it took that much more for people to really see what was going on and start to move around. By the way, those signs above all the doors are based on Japanese subway signs for a couple reasons. Number one, they're dealing with different information, and people have got to get all over the place, and they layer their information both with text and symbols and all kinds of stuff. Also, they tend to have low ceilings, and maybe it's just because I'm a tall guy, but it's kind of uncomfortable when you have to sort of duck under stuff. And we were using reference like that to we want our spaces to feel slightly uncomfortable. Not so much that it's a usability problem where the camera bangs against it or anything, but just sort of get that feeling of just sort of like it wasn't built for you. Anyway, here's how the signs work. And you can see on the bottom, we would change it up. The logo would get more advanced, and the other sort of stuff would happen as we go to other parts of the ship. But the side benefit, the thing we ran into, we had these really cool textures and all kinds of stuff, and the text would do all this kind of stuff. The problem was that it was deemed that the labels above the doors were conveying gameplay information, and therefore needed to be localized for all of our different SKUs. So we had to go to a dynamic text solution, what actually ended up helping us, and although it was a pain, it worked out really well. So now people can get out of one room, but they're kind of lost in total about where to go, right? And if you think of Crazy Taxi or GTA or Bioshock or all these, they'll have an arrow right at the top of the screen that you can bring up or bring down, and it'll point you sort of in the right direction, or Call of Duty has it on their compass on the bottom. But so how do we get that into our game and get people that information, but in a way that doesn't blow everything that we've just accomplished? So one of the first ideas was doing a direction arrow, kind of how we'd solved the other problems. We were going to do a direction arrow, but projected off of him, just like the other stuff in the world goes. The problem was, as he runs, it would sort of bounce and do stuff and sort of be difficult to follow. But if you locked it in screen space, well, then you've just made a screen space arrow. So that one backfired on us. And then we went too far the other direction, and I started to, Hitchcock calls them MacGuffins, Walt Disney called them weenies, but sort of things that pull you through the world. And we started to add sort of MacGuffin lights, like around the world, trying to figure out, oh, okay, hey, buddy, this is the way to go. That didn't work, because we went too far to the other direction. It was totally in the world, but it didn't solve the problem. Then one day, someone said, hey, we've got nav graphs through the whole world for the AI anyway. It would take me like a day and a half to just draw a line from you to the nearest nav graph node, and then along the nodes to where the next goal is. And it took almost nothing to implement this feature, and it was one of our most popular things in the end. And it was one of those instances where sticking to the guns of no, we want no UI in the world, ended up with something that I thought solved the problem really well. A quick note about how all the stuff works. We based the computer imagery on like early 80s Radio Shack TRS-80 kind of stuff. The idea being, again, sci-fi and horror don't really jive. Like sci-fi is a world where anything's possible and there's all sort of cool technology and you're not in that much trouble. The point behind all this stuff and why it looks degraded and scanline and vector graphics is these computers will not help you. If you were trying to do a search, it would take it 10 minutes. Like, it's not going to tell you that there's a monster in the next room. Looking at those computers, you have pretty low expectations about what it's going to do for you. And that was sort of the point, compared to as soon as we said, like, oh, you got a menu out, and people would go like, oh, like Minority Report. But Minority Report, that dude can control the world, like all in front of him. He could make anything happen. He could solve crimes virtually. And we didn't want anything like that, so it had to work, but it had to look cool, but not too cool. All right, now we're into the environment design. So these are slides that I showed to the team when we started doing our environments. So this is about 2 years old, trying to get everybody sort of aligned about what we were trying to do and get the feeling. So when you're making up a spaceship or a future thing, it's pretty easy to get most of the way. You sort of can make up anything. Again, the problem with horror is if you don't really believe this setting, you're not going to believe any of the terrible stuff that's happening in it. So we were conscious to pull back on the futurism and to make it very readable and very relatable as a setting. And you could really tell how this spaceship was held up and how it was worked and how it had structure. And the best equivalent we could find in sort of architecture was Gothic stuff, especially Gothic churches. As soon as I say Gothic, people start to think of like doom and pentagrams and emo kids sketching on their folder. It's not that kind of Gothic. It's that style of architecture where you can really see, like if you see Notre Dame or other sort of Gothic examples, you can really tell how those buildings are held up. Like they've got a buttress to the side and they've got this arch and they've got this rib coming down. And you can sort of read them very well compared to modern architecture, which sometimes intentionally is cantilevered or something that looks like, I don't even know how that's held up, which 3D graphics kind of does anyway when you don't mean it to. So this was, we adapted Gothic architecture and distilled it down into these rules that we tried to get into the world. So on the top is reference pictures. On the bottom there is concept art from the game, and I took it and sort of tried to explain why it got approved. So the first theme that we did is ribbing for a couple reasons. One, it's very readable. Second, in a dynamic light environment on ours, it looks really good when shadows sort of cascade over ribbed forms. You can really read a shadow, and it looks really cool. We've all done sort of stuff where you put a good spec map on something, but if the light isn't there to help it out, you don't really get anything out of it. So ribbed surfaces really work well with dynamic lighting like we were doing. Second, kind of the same thing, visible supports, flying buttresses. So a lot of times in the game, you'll get columns and posts and supports and things that sort of both make the ship look like a ship and make it really readable, like you know how it's put together. Negative space and layering is just trying to get visual interest as you move the camera. You get parallax, you get interesting stuff going on, and in those sort of pixel changes, you kind of don't know, is that a dude back there? Like you don't really know what's going on, and as opposed to a more static sort of setup. So we were always trying to build in negative space, even in our walls and all that kind of stuff. In the midst of all this, then, games tend to have lots of medium-sized detail for usability or for whatever reason, right? You get a light switch and it's like this big in the real world, and you get stuff that's sort of out of scale. Everything ends up sort of medium-sized. So we intentionally went either really big or really small, like super dense, repeaty detail that you could really look at a lot, or big forms. So we tried to avoid medium-sized stuff. And then last, with all this layering and ribs and visual noise and strong, straight supports, you need a little visual break. And so we try to incorporate circles every once in a while just to sort of clean things up. So this is some other stuff. These were concept art pieces that I would show to them and be like, oh, okay, see why this got approved? Look, it's got the circles, it's got the ribs, it's got the thing. Win. So here's some more. You can see how these all worked out. And then here's a quick look at like a piece of concept art and what the finished space looked like in the game. Real quick, lots of the circular dentist lights where this theme came from, well, I already said it, is from dentist lights. We tried to sort of think of real-world situations where you were uncomfortable and not having a good time. And the dentist chair is one of the chief ones, because if your dentist is like 50 and you had that office and you started it like 20 years ago, and it's had that same lens on there and it's yellow and it's got like a fly in it, and you're looking at it the whole time and you just sort of feel interrogated. We were and like, you can't really see it in this shot, but a lot of our lighting is on arms like that, again, to imply that sort of subliminal feeling of we wanted no indirect light. Like Star Trek is all about like light behind lucite and sort of indirect lighting that looks pleasant and nice. We always had a source that was aimed like right at you or right at the ground to make you sort of feel interrogated. Same thing you can see in the upper right. Sometimes bonus points, ribs on circles. And then there's about 11 levels to the game, and we knew we couldn't build them all individually, so we developed sort of neighborhood looks that different levels would sort of adopt one or more of the looks. And you can see the motifs sort of evolve, like the ribs, which are really obvious and structural in the industrial neighborhoods, become more of just like a light motif in the clean areas. You can see on the light fixtures, and then the public is sort of somewhere in between. So here's like an industrial piece of concept art. There's the public. You can still see some of the motifs, but they're starting to sort of become surface level stuff. And then finally in the clean, they start to put everything behind glass. And one quick note, we developed the whole glass look sort of before we realized that we were going to go full on with the deferred lighting, and it turns out that deferred really doesn't like transparency. And this kind of goes to Kojima's talk the other morning, where he was talking about sort of creative problem solving. The problem is the light always looked crap and wrong, and the lighting wasn't correct with it, and we were spinning and spinning for weeks trying to light the glass with forward rendering and have it match with everything else in the world which is done deferred. And eventually I just went, well, we should just make it look like it's supposed to be different. So we put lights under all the glass, so it looked like it was supposed to look brighter, because we couldn't make it not look brighter. So we just put lights behind all of it, and now what was once a problem is now no big deal. Quick note, and this was sort of a fight I had a lot with our executive producer and other people at the start, was that is a very pedestrian-looking fire extinguisher. I mean, that's it in the shipping game. And this is 400 years in the future. So I'm guessing that 400 years, a fire extinguisher 400 years from now is going to be like, whoop, fire's out. But that's not, if you took some guy from the 50s and showed him an iPhone, he wouldn't even get that it's a phone. And there's no visual communication happening there at all. So we were intentionally anachronistic with this kind of stuff for the reason, again, trying to give people easy entry into the world, to make it more believable, even though it doesn't make sense that they would have one 400 years from now. But you look at that and you go, oh, hey, fire extinguisher, I know how big those are. I know how heavy they are. I know what sound they make when you drop, bong, they make like a sound when you drop them. And it's a very relatable, iconic thing. And then when you put an old-style fire extinguisher next to something more fantastical like a hologram or a laser gun, people they buy the whole world, and they're into the laser gun now more than they would have been otherwise. But early on, when the bosses, I'm like, hey, Mr. Art Director, what does the future fire extinguisher look like? And I go, looks like the one I found on Google. It took some convincing. Another thing we would do with the environments is this sort of signage around the world. And we did this for 2 reasons. From a storytelling perspective, 3, to get some color into it. And second, from a storytelling perspective, our entire game takes place in an aftermath. And if you don't have any idea of what the culture or story or world or whatever was going on here, like if there's a big dead body and you don't have any concept of what that person was like or what the culture was before this all went down, you're not really going to care that much. So we tried to illustrate what the value system and what the sort of world was like before you got there, and that really helps with the horror. Second, so here's that same one in the world. Second, there's only ever one of these in the game ever. So there's I want to say there's about 120 unique signs, and we never repeat one. Both because it's always adding visual interest, and you're like, oh, okay, but also for landmarking. When you're going, because we do a lot of out and back and different sorts of paths, and then when you go, oh, I'm in the hallway with this poster again, you're like, oh, okay, I know where I am. And if we ever broke that contract and showed one twice, it would blow that whole thing. So it didn't do wonders for our production schedule, but it really helped in the usability. All right. So now, on to the player character. So check these guys out. Right? All very popular. And completely inappropriate for the kind of feeling we were trying to create. But they're super cool. And a lot of the pressure we got early on was to design, some guy along these ways. But look at those guys. They're not scared of nothing. Like, I mean, how many alien asses has Master Chief kicked along the way? Like, when a new alien shows up, like, you're not even remotely scared. So how to come up with a cool guy, but that had a feeling of vulnerability and relatability and appropriateness. So we were looking at, first of all, tangible, real textures like leather and cloth and stuff, not super fancy stuff. I mean, look, they already got the ribs on him. I didn't even have to do anything. And the key idea was, you are a dude who's not designed to be shot at. He doesn't have any anatomical sort of reinforcement and like huge breastplates or whatever. He's got armor on because we needed that, but it looks like it's used to lift heavy things, not to get shot at. So here are some of the concept drawings along the way, trying to figure out the rig is a nightmare, trying to get all these hard surface stuff to move correctly and sort of balance along the way. But, and then that's where we ended up. It's funny because two things happened. First of all, we were on the cover of Game Informer 2 weeks after BioShock came out, and immediately there was a lot of, oh my God, Big Daddy ripoff. And the two things, I was always like, well, no, he's ultramarine and this color because those are complementary colors and it makes the ultramarine color pop, and that's how you can totally... Oh, by the way, the UI, we never use that color except for his health bar. So that way on the screen, your eye can always read it. And it's the complement to sort of the warm tones that almost all of the screen usually is, so it pops the most. But of course, that's basic color theory, and it's not like the guys at 2K Boston don't know the same stuff, so you get the Big Daddy. And second of all, it was 2 weeks. Like BioShock, it was 2 weeks later we were on the magazine, and I always wanted to go, do you really think that we ripped off and managed to create a new dude in that amount of time? So, on to the weapons. That's a real gun. Like, that's a current real gun. And it looks like a toy. Like, modern guns are lame, and they don't feel very scary. And they're made out of plastic, and they make lame sounds. Like, whenever they have, you always hear, like, guns these days because of Hollywood and stuff. Real guns sound sort of wimpy and firecrackery and don't look particularly impressive. So we knew that, first of all, firearms were the wrong call for our guy. And second, we needed something that communicated horror right off the bat. Aha. So you look at those, and you're immediately like, oh, okay, yes, now those are horror things. But so now we settled on tools and power tools because, anybody who sort of doesn't, I don't have a lot of experience with power tools, but when those first couple times you pick up a radial saw, you are very sort of careful with the whole affair. But they have certain cues about them. First of all, they're concerned about communicating their danger. So they've got bright colored guards on them, and they've got very distinct... They're also not trying to sort of hide themselves. So they've got bold shapes and silhouettes because they're about functionality. So they tend to have strong primary shapes like circles and squares and bold colors. So you can see now in our weapons how that sort of translated across. They've got bold colors on them, the same sort of readability, that sort of protective cage around stuff. And that's what we were trying to do, is get that same relatability and fear factor in power tools into our weapons. Okay, now we're on to the enemies. Here's some drawings from when we started, when we kind of didn't know. We just were like, scary aliens. But there's been a billion scary aliens, and how to make they're not really horror. Like, there's been bad aliens in a million sci-fi movies and stuff, but they don't really feel that horrific. And nothing here was, the one on the lower left was kind of happening, but for the most part, these just all felt derivative and not really working for us. So I was like, okay, we need to bring it back. We need more relatability, more human form, more stuff that you can sort of feel something about them. And we got a little closer. That guy in the lower middle there, the sort of ochre-colored guy, his one good eye kind of gives you a little bit of relatability into him that makes him horror in the way that none of the others are. And we started to sort of feel that, and that sort of tipped us towards that way, much more towards the feeling that, like John Carpenter's The Thing gives compared to Alien or Predator or any of that kind of stuff. So you start to see it sort of come along. Here was the first design that we decided, oh, hey, that's good enough to make, like that. I mean, we pretty much thought that was going in the game. You can see now, much more human form, not purely zombie. We added the big sort of pokey things because we needed stuff to dismember. And you could sort of start to feel the whole, a little more sort of, oh, okay, I know that used to be a person, but it's not a straight zombie. That's how the model came across. And our early work had this guy in for a long time. But it just sort of, you can't really read what happened to him. It looks like what used to be a person and maybe got burned real bad, or he got bubbled into a thing of goo, and then he came back. But you didn't really feel the transition, and he wasn't readable. Again, what we're going for is immersion and readability and relatability, and that's where we ended up. So you know what happened to that poor girl. You can read everything along the way of, oh, okay. Plus, she's got a visual hook where like half of her is twisted around and all kinds of stuff. And we came up with little stories about what happened to each enemy. And that eventually really helped. And now we're back in horror like we want to be instead of those early aliens we started with. Okay. So now we're sort of transitioning the talk a little bit into the what went right kind of stuff. So one thing that went right for us a lot in the project artistically is that we pushed internal PR harder than I ever thought we were gonna. But it really, really helped on two fronts. Number one, we were just trying to get the name out there, and we're competing against Need for Speed or whatever. Like everybody knows what that is and what it's coming out, and what it's about. No one knew what we were about, so we had posters before we had anything. We had demos all the time. We knew that it had to be great and on the screen and in people's face. I gave a demo to the chef from the cafeteria. Just because, like, hey, he's talking to everybody all day, right? Everybody's going through the line. And he'd be like, oh, I saw that Dead Space. It's awesome. Maybe the VP goes through and he tells them about it. Whatever. We would just give demos all the time, trying to sort of, doing viral stuff all over everywhere. It also helped us distill our messages for ourselves. Like if you're trying to communicate in a poster already before you even know what your game design is, you in one image, you start to sort of hone your whole message a lot better. This was another thing that went really right for us that I hadn't done before. Like a lot of places, EA is making use of a lot of outsourcing these days. And talent didn't actually turn out to be that big a problem. The largest problem was communication. And regular concept paintings and block worlds like this weren't cutting it. There was too much area for things to go wrong. So this is what a typical block world would have looked like on games that I worked on previously. And that's a Dead Space block world, which sort of goes way beyond the term. But what we would do is, after we had the concept art, we would build the whole level as fast as we possibly could, giving absolutely no heed to texturability, zonability, clean geo, collision, all the kind of stuff you need to do to really make a level work. But we would get dirty lights in there, we would get geo in there, we would get everything in there as fast as possible. And it really crystallized our process because you could see it on screen and everybody go, oh, okay, yes, awesome. The downside would be that's not really valid geo in terms of you can't, it's not texturable, you can't really make it work yet. So telling the bosses that, no, the level's not done. This is really like 3D concept art. But in terms of, we would then give this to outsourcers or with our internal team, and they could easily get, oh, okay, I'm supposed to model right on top of this, and we're sort of work right on top of this. And that turned out to be a huge win. It also, by getting early lighting in, it's a horror game, right? In case you haven't noticed. And with the lighting, it would give us two things. Number one, it would help us sort of establish pools of light and visual interest in areas where we needed extra detail and extra focus and less so. But also, in a horror game, sometimes the art is the gameplay. Like we may have been setting up a rhythm where you got attacked in a couple hallways, and then here's another hallway that looks similar, and you might get attacked again, but you don't. And without that, unless the art is relatively far along where you can get a sense of the mood, we would find that there was a huge temptation from designers and from reviewers and stuff that they would be like, put a monster in there, I'm bored. because they're going down this hallway and nothing happens. But in the actual game experience, it's really valuable because they're creeping along and they're looking for stuff. And if it's shadowy, people got that much better than if we had said, oh, well, nothing happens here and it's boring now, but it'll be awesome later when it's all arted up. We had to do something that gave an idea earlier than we were used to, and it really, really paid off. This one seems obvious, but it really, really paid off more than we could ever imagine. Dead Space doesn't have that much stuff in it compared to what we thought we were going to make. But from early times, we decided we were going to do less better than try to get it a million more features or a million more other things. And that really, really helped. And our polish and presentation was pretty much the highest scoring aspects of Dead Space. And it helped us control what problems we tackled. And if you notice back in the beginning when I did the breakdown of the frame, we don't really do that much compared to all the buzzwords going around. There's no filmic tone mapping. There's no HDR. There's not that much going on with our rendering besides we bit off the giant deferred thing. But it's relatively modest compared to some of the engine stuff that's going on now. What we decided to do was cut that stuff off pretty early to give our artists a chance to become fluent and learn how to make great-looking stuff with this. And that really helped. I mean, it wasn't like they were hobbled by what features we had, but it helped us, like I said, with the example of putting the light underneath the glass. We went from a philosophy of there's no magic bullet coming from the engine. We need to figure out how to art this so it looks great. And for most of the feedback, people think the game is more feature-rich graphically than it really is because we had time to really dial in the art fundamentals that were there. Real quick, you can see sort of what our polish phase looked like. The game shipped on October 14th, and working backwards, we didn't add anything new past the end of May. All summer, all we did was make stuff better, tighter, smoother, whatever. And that really, really, really helped. And last there, compared to a lot of stuff we'd done, we did a ton of focus group and testing and all kinds of stuff to see what was going on. One of the most painful ones was around April or May. The feedback kept coming back that character sucks, too slow, I don't feel agile or cool. The problem is all of our worlds were spaced and timed, so if you ran from one door to the other, it would be ready by the time you got there. But if you speed the character up, now it's not. And so we made the tough decision to rebuild most of the game for the new character speed, because if the character's not fun, you got nothing. And so that was incredibly painful, but it ended up really paying off because our command and control stuff was well received. Okay, let's see. Got about 20 minutes left. So what I wanted to do at this point is, these are all work in progress examples. It's a little more free form. And I'll show you sort of different things at different stages along in the production, and you can sort of see what it looked like. And then as we sort of get towards the end, or depending on what people are doing, we'll go to questions. Okay, so this here, we're like a month in now, and we're just trying to prove out ideas the dirtiest and quickest way we possibly could. So this was just a thing that ran on the PC. No character, no nothing. Oh, awesome. Always helpful. Excuse me for just a second. I don't know why that disassociated, but I'll fix that later. We can skip around. So we also would do, because it'll handle QuickTimes, right? We would also do these for our characters. These sort of the same things we would do for. Remember, I did like the 3D concept art for the worlds. We would do 3D concept art for the characters. Now that seems sort of counterintuitive, but again, that guy's not very texturable. He's not. His geometry's kind of dirty, but whatever. But that guy was modeled, rigged, and animated in 2 days just to get it out there. Like, does that feel right? Because his whole gimmick was he was the pregnant, and he had this sort of weight to heave around. And the idea with reinforcing the dismemberment mechanic was You wanted guys that it really was negative to shoot. Not just it's better to dismember them, but you would actually get yourself in more trouble if you didn't do it right. So he would burst open if you got him in the gut. And these things, again, were a huge help because one person would just bang them out. And then everybody could sort of vibe on it in a way that you never could with just a painting or whatever. Now, we wouldn't necessarily keep these or we wouldn't do it exactly this way, but it got people talking around a tangible element. And that really, in the end, sped us up quite a bit. So I'll sort of go through. What did you do to this computer, Chuck? These all worked before I got here. So here's the another guy. So like right there, that wasn't in the design when he grabs on the ceiling. But you see this kind of stuff happen, and the animator's just like, wouldn't it be cool if, or whatever. But a designer goes, oh, like, and an engineer raises his hand. And we surfaced this stuff really early because a boss would see that and go, oh, my God, that's awesome. But then it gave everybody a chance to sort of chime in and do a whole thing there. So I tell you what, why don't I go to the question part, because I'm going to try and get these working at the same time as answering questions. Well, here, let me try real quick. So I'll go to the questions in a second. So where was the... So this is what the game looked like when it got greenlit in May 2007. Most of everything is here. So this is all we had. It was about 15 minutes to half an hour of gameplay. But after 14 months, this is the game. This was so early, I always wanted to maybe, right at the end, like right there, I wanted the end of the 8 to break off, just in case we didn't make our date. Because it could have been, who knows, like this whole time I could have been saying, no, if you look back, we never said 2008. So I'm going to try to get this last early one working, and if it doesn't happen for us, I don't know why an MPEG, let's see. See if QuickTime will enjoy the MPEG. If it doesn't, we'll go right to the end. Hey. So, just stop this one real quick. When we started, we had no engine, like I said. So keeping with our philosophy of trying to get pixels on the screen as fast as possible, we used an old Bond game engine to make the game on the original Xbox. Now, it was never meant, the Xbox was never going to be its shipping platform. It was never, this wasn't like an Xbox project that got scuttled and brought back, but we wanted to get our ideas on screen as fast as possible to see if any of them were any good, really. So this is what the game looked like towards the end of 06, maybe about 10 months. So only 6 months separates this from what you just saw. But you'll see that a lot of ideas were a lot different, and some of the things that I talked about were we hadn't quite made it. So the enemies are totally different. The player is totally different. Hopefully he's awesome. That's super scary. But you can see the bones are there. All right, so that's sort of the main part of the talk then. I thought now would be, we've got about 10 minutes left, maybe a little bit less. There's a microphone right there if you want to open up for questions. And because I am not above petty bribery, I brought concept art books. So you ask a question, walk away, worked for Iwata, bring gifts. So after you ask a question, come up on and snag one.
Yay. In your use of color to provoke emotions throughout the game, being like the horror genre, did you kind of pre-plan that in any way? Like, or did you find that it was more useful on just a random kind of scene-by-scene basis, or did it kind of follow the character arc?
Yeah, at first, it was one of those things that turned out to be extraordinarily useful where we did it more than we planned on. We did plan on a certain amount. We did like a color script for the levels and then sort of for the areas. And then we went, holy crap, that's awesome. But it wasn't like we intended to do 4 color lookups for that boss fight. It was just sort of like, wow, every time we do it, this is really paying off and really helping out emotionally. So let's do it even more.
I wondered if you could speak a bit more about the deferred lighting system, and as an artist on the team, what were the requirements to make the rooms look so good?
Without geeking out too much about it, because I don't know the math as well, but the idea behind deferred lighting is that you're doing a lot of your calculations in screen space outside of the normal rendering chain compared to typical lighting and rendering. The upshot is that it makes all the lights can animate, move, or do whatever you want, and it costs nothing more than what you would have normally done. So we could have hundreds of lights. The difference would be is that what their cost was screen space. So one light washing across the whole scene would cost just as much as 100 tiny lights that covered the same number of pixels on screen. So that was a boon in a lot of ways because, hey, we're on a spaceship. It's all artificial lighting. We don't have a big sun. It would be difficult for some other games to do that because they might be in a more naturalistic setting where they're trying to wash a lot of light. It was also difficult for our lighters to get used to because a lot of them came from film, and they're used to washing a scene with a lot of subtle lights that would layer a lot, and layering lighting is what would kill us. So it was particularly lined up with what we wanted to do, and that really paid off. But like I said, the other bad thing is transparency. It doesn't work because there is no notion of transparency because stuff is happening in screen space, and things always looked weird. So we had to treat glass, make glass really dirty, so it wasn't that reflective or clear. Our characters couldn't have any transparency on them, so some of our hair doesn't look that hot because there's no, we can't do anything with it. So that's sort of the ramifications. But it was a huge win in terms of getting light we could shoot out lights and do whatever we wanted. It was all free computationally.
This is more of a high-level question about horror aesthetics in general. Mm-hmm. But, of course, one of the most important things about creating a horror atmosphere is fear of the unknown, not knowing what's going to happen. How do you reconcile that with the repetitiveness that's pretty endemic to games in general?
Yeah, it's a trick one. You're right. You're always trying to keep players on their toes, and tricks wear off fast. I think it was to sort of do some judo with it and try to turn that repetition into an asset in terms of we would do the same gag or the same setup a couple times, but then flip it, and by then purposely letting that repetition become a rhythm that people get used to. So when you disrupt that rhythm, you're sort of taking advantage of that expectation. And that was what we tried to do to sort of get the horror back into it. But it's difficult because, you're doing the same thing, and it's not, you don't want to stop and have a conversation about how scared you are as a character, and so it was difficult. But that's what we tried to do, is embrace that repetition rather than sort of run from it. Cool.
Hi, my question is not like directly art related maybe, but I've been looking at your video from 2006. And I've compared it like to the final game, mm-hmm. and I noticed that the gameplay almost didn't seem to have changed during the 2 years of development. Mm-hmm. So I've been wondering, has art serviced game design, or did game design change to service the art direction in any way?
Not much. That was the whole point of the first 10 months was to get our game stuff to a fun place. I mean, we missed on a couple things, but no, art was definitely trying to take advantage and reinforce what game design was trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. In terms of, the obvious examples are, dismemberment was the key mechanic, and they were like, we need enemies with, 10 tentacled octopus creatures and stuff like that to sort of take advantage of it. But that was the whole point, is that we didn't want to sort of have design evolving so late, because look at how detailed the stuff is. One of those worlds was incredibly difficult to try to change along the way. You're right, it worked out really well that we managed to lock in a lot of design stuff really early.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Hi. Just out of curiosity, because I once worked in a team with a comparable situation, which of the other 3 projects got canned instead of yours?
In that case, Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Okay.
Not our fault.
Okay.
And it wasn't like any of them, it was unrelated. It wasn't like any of them were destined to get canned or anything, but, that's how it happens. Stuff just goes on, and we just knew that we were the low man on the totem pole in terms of it wasn't, it wasn't automatic that we would come out.
But it's cool that you're perceived. Congratulations.
Yeah.
So you already touched a bit on this, but obviously smaller lights is better, deferred-wise. Mm-hmm. But in the cases where you did have reasonably large lights, did you have any tools for controlling them, or making sure they didn't bleed into other areas and stuff like that?
Not as good as we should have, because we didn't really get bit on the lighting thing until we were really sort of trying to round out the world. And that's one of the things for future deferred titles, is that we need to be able to constrain big lights better, because you don't realize, if you're trying to get a nice fall off and a nice real vibe to stuff, you don't realize how wide that light is actually affecting. But that was sort of part of the testing, was to constantly be turning lights on and off and to see, does the cone really need to be that wide? What's really happening over here that's that important? Because it was super costly.
Yeah. Did you try and adapt your art direction and concepts and stuff like that to fit that?
I went back down to the concept artists and we're like, we need banks of tiny lights, situations. Don't think of like the one light that's casting light through the whole room. Think of 100 tiny ones that are sort of illuminating in spots and sort of coming in, but don't wash it in the same way. So we were set up for success from the start. So the lighters weren't, because that would happen early on. The lighters would try to match a look and to achieve a goal that everybody was into, but then the deferred wasn't really, we needed to sort of align the whole team around that sort of style. But it worked out perfect for a sci-fi horror setting.
Hey, can you talk any about the Wii version of the game?
A little bit. Get the signal that this needs to be the last question, but I'll just be outside afterwards, so don't bail necessarily. Wii version of the game, Dead Space Extraction, is coming out this fall. It's a completely original project. New engine, new everything, all kinds of stuff, several of the same people involved. It's a prequel in story to this, but it's not a port. It's an entirely original project.
That's awesome.
All right, so thanks everybody.